the close of the day. This is a very carefully considered and constructed sequence of panels, and this will follow, if not quite seamlessly, pretty close to from the first panel, as we're still going to home in on most of those 11 SDGs that were picked out by the IOC earlier, but very much taking on a UN perspective as well now. The title for panel 2 is, as you see on the screen. I'm delighted to invite Professor Margaret Baddeley from the University of Geneva to facilitate this session. All yours, Margaret.
Okay,
thank you.
Thank you very much. We've seen in panel 1 that all the efforts made and projects in terms of sustainable development goals of the sports organizations, of the top sports organizations. The same movement is going on within the UN family, of course, and we're going to focus on that with panel 2. Of course, the impact of anything the UN agencies do is huge in terms of countries reached and populations. A third actor that is very important in all that, and is already transpired in the previous panel, is of course in every country, the country itself, the government, the governmental bodies. The three together have to tackle an enormous task. It is very difficult, very complex. And it is probably, there's no need to stress that for that reason, it is absolutely paramount to collaborate, to help each other, and also, and we're going to talk about that in this panel, to evaluate actions taken and how to carry on from certain points in time. This panel is made up of representatives of 4 key UN agencies. I present to you Ms. Sarah Sekanes. Sarah Sekanes is the United Nations program UNDP representative, and she is in conflict prevention and partnership advising. Then we have Philippe Müller-Wirth of UNESCO. Philippe is executive officer for sport. Furthermore, we've got, now I have to take a big breath, Wondwansen Aznake Kibret of the United Nations Organization for Culture and Science and Culture, UNESCO. And
UN Environment.
Sorry, I'm on the wrong line. Yes, of UNEP. He is the Policy and Partnership Coordinator of the Europe Office. And last but not least, certainly, we have Valerio Iovine, Program Manager, Program Services, Private Fundraising and Partnership Division. Thank you all for coming. We will hear from our experts. They will relate to us their experiences on programs, on strategies, because there exists both. There can be just a strategy in place, there can be additional programs, there can be projects. They will talk to us about the collaborations they have been able to set up, the use of these collaborations, and also the obstacles they found, both in headquarters and in the field, putting into place whatever program or project they had in mind to achieve the objectives that we know are targeted. The ambition here is extremely high, and therefore we in our panel will also deal with one of the subjects about how to evaluate, how to check what has been done, how efficient it was. And before giving the floor to our panelists, I'd also like to stress that apart from the international community and the community of sports organizations, the academic community is very interested in these subjects, of course. We are, especially in Lake Geneva region, we are working at that. We have been working at that for many years. There are the two universities of Geneva and Lausanne. There is the EPFL, the École Polytechnique Fédérale, and our common foundation, AISTS, Académie Internationale des Sciences et Techniques du Sport, which is the organization of which Claude Stricker, who was facilitator of panel 1, is the executive director. We would like to stress that there is a need for knowing, and Mrs. Favre Pilet has said it in the beginning, we need to know, we need to apply, and then we need to evaluate, and then we have to see how we go on. So having given this introduction, I would like to just simply say that what we do in this panel, we will not really highlight the action of every single organization. We have put on the platform that you all have found, I think, we have put on the platform a document with the different programs of the different organizations. You can look it up. It is maybe, we hope, as exhaustive as possible. We can also upload a little bit more on that within the next few days. Therefore, we wanted to concentrate on subjects. And as you have seen, the first subject, which should appear on our screen, the first subject is the Kazan plan, the Kazan action plan. That is, well, I did not present myself. I'm professor at law at Geneva University, and I'm interested in sports law and sports in general. And I've always also been the vice rector of the university, and of course we're interested in implementing programs and research projects relating to sustainable development. My help is Mr. Monkelborn in the first row, and I think we have now completed the panel, and we can go to subject 1. Subject 1 is the Kazan action plan. You found it on the platform, and there we would like to discuss with our members of the panel how to foster collaboration by common strategy within UN agencies in view of reaching the 11 or even more sustainable development goals sustainable development goals together with the other stakeholders maybe as far as sports is concerned. What are the lessons we can learn from this plan and from its implementation? Please, Philippe, could you tell us some about that?
Thank you, Margareta. Thank you for the hosts for bringing us all together and for inviting UNESCO to this panel. Just a few words, if you allow, to all those who may associate UNESCO exclusively with World Heritage. Our role in sport is built on two main pillars. One, education, including quality physical education in schools, and sport values education in a very broad sense. And two, sport policy development. For the latter pillar, we have four unique instruments in the UN system. The first is the International Convention Against Doping in Sport, and I'm happy that this is not the subject today. The second is the International Charter of Physical Education and Sport, revised in 2015 to become the International Charter of Physical Activity, Physical Education and Sport. The third is the Intergovernmental Committee for Physical Education and Sport, which is a sort of miniature Switzerland, i.e. it brings together 18 member states, but also all the UN organizations, the main sports federations, academia and NGOs. And the fourth is the World Conference of Sport Ministers, MINEPS. I will not explain that acronym, which dates back some 40 years. So the World Conference of Sport Ministers is a forum. All these instruments, especially the three-letter ones, are multi-stakeholder instruments. The core role we have in the UN system is to help sport ministries enhance their capacities and enhance their policies. But it has turned out over the last years that the fora and the committees we run are becoming increasingly multi-stakeholder fora, because sport policy, as you all will easily understand, is not just a matter for sport ministries, but for many other government entities, and also for sports federations. As we had heard in the first panel, a number of sport policy issues have actually been presented, standards and their enforcement, collective objectives, and capacities built to ensure that these objectives can be achieved. The last conference of sport ministers took place in July 2017, so 3 months ago, not even. And it focused on action. The sport ministers in particular, but the broader sport policy community, is saturated with declarations. So the first message is we have to move into action mode. The second message clearly is it is about sport in itself, the running of sport, but it's also about the contribution of sport to the SDGs. The Agenda 2030 must guide future sport policy development. The Kazan Action Plan has two main components. First, a set of 5 actions to which the international community is dedicating its international cooperation over the next years, pending MINEPS 7, and I come back to that. And the second component is a sport policy follow-up framework. With respect to the first, I think this is about policy effectiveness. We have the coherence and the effectiveness issue on this agenda. And effectiveness meaning that we have to start investing our very limited resources, be it by governments and other stakeholders, to some priority activities and actions at the international level. And I will only mention 2 because the time is short. The first is clearly that sport policy has to be carried on a number of shoulders within governments and beyond governments. And for that to happen, we need to advocate. We need to establish partnerships, as I said before, from the sports perspective, but it is definitely true for sport ministers, who are very often the least important members of their governments and very often are imposed on agendas by other members of their governments and have a hard time resourcing what they'd be actually supposed to be doing. Advocacy is a core issue, and we need to think about why have we failed to convince members of governments who have real decision-making powers to invest more in sport and physical education, and how can we bring in other decision-makers and influential stakeholders to invest more in sport and scale up programs. The second actions, and I think we come back to that issue, is the development of indicators measuring the contribution of sport to the SDGs. If we don't measure that contribution, if we can't quantify and qualify with empirical data that sport is actually making a difference, we will have a hard time convincing the international donor community and other investors to increase their investments in physical activity and sport. So again, we have an upscaling agenda very clearly here, and I think we'll talk about impact measurement later on in this panel. What has turned out to be a quite surprising strong element is that sport policy follow-up framework, which is the second component of the Kazan Action Plan. In the past, we had a hard time locating different sport policy issues in a consensual fashion. And what MINEPS does is creating consensus, i.e. coherence, amongst sport ministers around the world, on the one hand, but also about other sport policy stakeholders, be it the UN system, be it sports organizations, be it academia. And so the sport policy framework is structured into 3 main policy areas. One is providing universal access for all, and it deals with, first of all, having a strategy in countries, sports federations, that targets that universal access across different forms of discrimination. Gender equality is a main issue, and partnerships, one again, are a main issue in that very first policy area. The second policy area is maximizing the contributions of sport to the SDGs. And what we have done, and I think of the intervention from ENSCO Youth about the 17 SDGs, we have went the opposite way. We have, in MINEPS, decided to make the case for sport, we have to prioritize. Even if we acknowledge sport can make a difference across the 17 SDGs, we have, and thanks to the Commonwealth, identified 8 priority SDGs to which sport ministers, but also the other sport policy stakeholders feel sport makes a significant contribution. All this can be checked on the website. It's of course related to health, but also urban planning, education of course, gender equality, accountable institutions, etc. 8, not 17, not 11, which is for a UN system exercise quite something remarkable. Normally we opt for everything, and we have a hard time prioritizing. MINEPS has achieved that in the last conference. And third main policy area, protecting the integrity of sport. And here I think, again, a breakthrough. We have defined what we mean by sport integrity, and we have identified 5 specific policy areas falling under that main policy area. You walk around the world and you have sport integrity fora of all sorts, but they normally deal with specific parts of sport integrity. Now, for once, there is an international consensus saying, what do we mean by sport integrity in terms of human rights issues, in terms of child protection, in terms of match fixing, good governance, and doping. So this policy framework is expected and already becoming a reference for the development of sport policies by regional organizations like ASEAN, like governments. The Philippines in the Asia Pacific with a very strong momentum already implementing the Kazan Action Plan before UNESCO has even issued any form of guidance on how to do it. And by sports federations who have also approached us to say we would like to develop a practical toolkit translating the Kazan Action Plan into our federation's policies. So this is the sport coherence, the policy coherence element of the Kazan Action Plan. In the next years, I hope what we will achieve doing is to bring together in a form that is easily structured along these policy areas. It's a quite simple framework, which I think is the charm of it. It's not so complex. Allow to share information about relevant norms, relevant tools, relevant indicators, research and promotional activities. These are what we call the follow-up parameters. So you have a matrix, and everything we see happening here and in other fora and by other initiatives falls into one of these boxes. And we hope that we will develop together with you. Many of you have been part in developing the Kazan Action Plan and will hopefully also be part in its follow-up in developing a knowledge-sharing tool that will enhance the capacities of the various stakeholders concerned.
Okay, thank you. This is the framework that was set up by the Kazan Plan. Of course, action had already taken place before. Action, there are programs, there are different strategies maybe in place. And also there is not yet the cohesion maybe that the Kazan Plan hopefully will bring. And therefore our second subject was, for the discussion now, was to talk about the other programs and projects, knowing that the UNESCO, that the Kazan Action Plan is for all. But nevertheless, we have to see what is going on other places and how the collaboration, if there is any, is taking place, and how maybe obstacles occurred and how these obstacles could be tackled. So I would like to ask these questions now about the other programs, projects, possibly also the integration into the Kazan Action Plan, obstacles, collaborations and obstacles. I would like to ask Wendy and I would like to ask Valerio to talk about those questions. Please, I give you the floor.
Thank you, Margaret. Let me start by saying I have no problem being called UNESCO. I'm actually from UN Environment, but what is important is actually speaking about this wonderful 2030 agenda, education is actually the glue that actually connects all other goals. So I'm very happy that I'm also part of UNESCO. Having said that, UN Environment, for those of you who are not familiar with us, we're basically the science base of the UN system. Our role is basically bringing science knowledge for policy making and decision making process. Then in the context of partnership, for example, with UNESCO, I think we have partnerships since its inception, but more specifically in the context of Kazan, there is an element of sustainability. Environment sustainability is actually embedded into...
It's one of the SDGs we have been choosing.
So, in that context, UN Environment has been working with member states, the IOC colleagues from the IOC, FIFA, and many other institutions. How do we embed sustainability principles into the organization of events? And this has been the DNA of our partnership. Not only partnership, actually, I don't want to call it, there is a huge difference when people say, we are partners, we collaborate. It is very different from working together. What we need is not partnership, is actually what are we doing together at the country level in terms of whether it is advancing the education agenda or whether it is advancing the 2030 agenda. Sustainable consumption and production is one work that we're very much engaged with UNESCO. How do I put it in a polite way? This is the most highly educated generation of all time. What do we do best? We pollute. We pollute, we pollute, we pollute. How do we change that? Not only in terms of that behavior, even if you affiliate it to personalities, we're smiling at people we don't even like. We are buying stuff we don't need. How do we change that? And that part of that changes in the context of the SDG 4.7, Education for Sustainable Development. How do we educate this generation and ourselves in terms of being more responsible in promoting sustainability, but also passing on a planet that we found a little bit better than we have found it. I think that is one core element of our business. And then I want to go back to, there were two wonderful questions, which is also linked to this agenda. Someone talked about sustainable cities. A huge, huge challenge at the moment. If I give you the statistics, our cities are only 2% of the total land, 2%. And imagine what comes out of them. 70% of GDP, economic activity, largely is from our cities. Over 60% of our energy consumption in the cities, in our wonderful cities. 70% of the greenhouse gas emission we're talking about, it's in the cities. 70% of global West. It's massive. So what is the role of education then in terms of advancing sustainability in our cities? The role of sport. And our engagement is not trying to turn everybody into sustainability manager. I think that we can do well. But how do we turn the majority sustainability practitioners? And that is exactly what is missing in terms of the practicality of what we do. Therefore, my take would be yes to working together. We are working together with many of the agencies and the countries, but we need to do more. We have been given an amazing opportunity with this new development agenda. Even if colleagues from the IOC have picked on 11 goals, that is already okay. I think that was the question at the back. Why only this? I think the message should be even use this 11 as a docking station to implement others. If you want to talk about poverty, poverty is basically about social, economic, environmental shocks. And that can be addressed whether through the inequality goal or through the goal on how do we build peaceful, resilient societies of tomorrow. And then resources. Of course, after the wonderful declaration in Kazan, who's going to pay for that?
Action plan.
Who is going to pay for that? Where is the money coming from? And I think somebody at the back also asked that question in terms of resources. I think we all caught up when we discussed the new development agenda. Everybody's talking about SDGs, SDGs, but there are other issues which are actually tied up to the new development agenda. One is called the Addis Ababa Action Plan for Financing for Development. And this specifically talks about domestic resource mobilization. Do we have the money at home? Mm-hmm. And that is one area where UN Environment has worked in the context of what we call inclusive green economy. How do we readjust the economies of today so that they are more sustainable, more resilient, they create jobs, but also they generate revenue. In that context, maybe most of the resources at home is invested in the wrong sector. So there comes the policy issue. How do we make sure that we look at our economies with a different lens? Can we reallocate these resources, which are literally invested in dead sectors, into somewhere that is more productive?
Okay. Wendy, if I understand you right, you talked about the objectives and you also talked about obstacles. And what we've seen is that it's not so easy to coordinate. I'm not even talking about collaboration, coordination. And we'll hear a bit more about that probably from Valerio. We are not too good on time, okay, but we would like to hear from you too. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much for having UNICEF as part of this panel. And I just want to build a bit on what my colleagues have said in terms of the importance of coordination. We are the UN agency mandated to protect and fulfill the rights of the children of the world, all around the world and everywhere, and in every condition, from emergencies to development settings. So inevitably, we have to be mandated and guided by what is the best interest of the child in every situation. So the issue of prioritization for us is quite important. Of course, we acknowledge and recognize the power of sport to achieve development at large, but we are the guardian of specific indicators and specific targets within the SDG dimension, you know, all the targets around education, gender equality, health, peace building as well. So, you know, we welcome any sort of focus and prioritization that actually aims to identify key areas for coordination. We have to be realistic and not hope or imagine then agencies of the UN system, which still have separate infrastructure and separate bureaucracy, all of a sudden will translate all the political dimension and debate that happened with the Kazan plan into action on the ground straight away. So if we are smart about it and if we are a bit selective, I think it wouldn't harm to try and identify those areas in which commonalities and convergence and coherence can be better achieved. And I think absolutely we believe in that, and we believe in partnership at the heart of what we do. I work in the headquarter division here in Geneva or in Switzerland that leads the organization efforts for partnership with the private sector. So for us, coordination amongst the UN agencies is absolutely crucial. But again, if we are informed by the best interest of the child, we need to be coordinated with what are the best actors to achieve that outcome for children. And may not well be other sister agencies. Sometimes they will be. Sometimes we need to seek that expertise outside. That's why we are delighted to have here some of our main partners in sport, even within this room. Obviously, you're all familiar with the partnership that UNICEF has with Football Club Barcelona, which is amongst us today, and it's great. Or the Commonwealth Games, or many other actors, the social legacy project of the London 2012 that we were also quite privileged to be part of. So all these more innovative, multi-stakeholder, extra UN partnerships with the world of sport and with the sport industry may sometimes and somehow even become more effective in the achievement of the SDGs, alongside better strengthening within the UN system. Yeah, if I can just add quickly, we absolutely contributed to the Kazan plan as UNICEF, and we absolutely value its sort of framework and the pillars as Philippe has described them. And I think we mirror our UNICEF strategic framework around sport exactly on those dimensions. Increasingly, we not just look at sport as a tool to achieve development outcomes for children and for societies at large, but we also work within sport, so within the sport industry and what we say around sport. So we have emerging specific strategies, for example, to protect the right of children while they play. Obviously, the Convention of the Right of the Child, Article 31, defines the right to play as a fundamental human right. but they may be obviously, you know, a situation of potential harm or abuse or exposure to threat that we need to address. And we cannot just address them alone by using just the usual advocacy voice of the UN. We need to do it within and with the partnership and the support and the buy-in from the sport industry. So we are leading on this international initiative on what we call child safeguarding in sport, but also around sport. This has been already mentioned before, like all the concept of social legacy of mega sporting events and what impact those events may have on human rights and on children's rights. The concept of legacy originally was centered around, obviously, physical infrastructure, or we need to make sure that actually stadia are used after the games, which is still very important. But we want to take the dimension beyond hardware legacy and go more into software legacy. So what is the impact on communities, on future generations? So we are increasingly working with that. And again, we can't do that alone. So absolutely, partnerships are crucial.
Thank you very much. We've seen that lots of initiatives are taking place. Everybody seems to agree we have to coordinate, we have to work together. We have to maybe restructure. This is probably a very painful process, but it will come about. It will have to come about if we want to convince governments, if we want to convince stakeholders of all kinds. Now, that is a question that has to be tackled by looking at what's happening and evaluating it. And that's what I would like to ask Sarah, please, to let us know how you perceive the actions that have been taken within the UN agencies, together with partners in the sporting world, possibly also with local governments, how you see that these actions will converge into something that will end up achieving the SDGs better, more efficiently. Please.
Thank you very much, and thank you also to the organizers for inviting us amongst other UN agencies, and I also see that there's additional sitting in the audience. Coming from UNDP, I think one of the things that we are known for, or if not, then you'll know it now, is the good governance aspects and kind of working in partnership with member states on the administration of public goods and services. So in that sense, we have almost like a convening role amongst UN agencies to bring the best out of all agencies together and work with our member state partners to set the priorities and plans for the implementation of the SDGs. And I'd like to also go back to a couple of the comments in the former panel, if I may, in terms of the Agenda 2030, which with the SDGs is a broad and extremely ambitious program of action that the world leaders and the countries that they represented adopted for the next 15, or rather 13 years now, knowing that time is running fast. So they sit as the custodians for it, and they are the ones responsible to report on it. But I would also like to draw the attention to, I think, Goal 12, that has to do with the sustainability that you spoke about, in terms of delivering on the SDG and responsibility to contribute. And I think some of you mentioned it in the former panel, because whilst the MDGs was very much of a social character and had a specific focus on developing states, in this round it's a universal agenda, and it actually targets each and every country in the world, which actually means that we not only in our professional capacity have a responsibility to contribute to the delivery of the SDGs, but also in our civilian capacity. We need to, if I may, sitting in Switzerland, reflect about our situation here in for consciousness and not least consumption patterns. We need to look at what can I do to contribute to the SDG agenda. And that thinking is what I need to bring into my professional ambitions and actions. And that actually brings me to one of the comments from the previous panel, which I hope was not meant to indicate that the partnerships with the UN agencies has deteriorated, because there was a comment saying that it was better in the past. But looking at the very, very ambitious agenda we have in front of us and the fact that it's well beyond the social character of the MDGs, it's so much more complex. Whereas before, someone mentioned the corporate social responsibility, it was graspable for private sector, for each and everyone who wanted to do good, look good. Whereas now it's so much more complex, and we have to go in towards the building standards and human rights and all the elements that were never discussed under the MDGs. So I'm hoping that the relationship between the sports and UN has not deteriorated. It's just become so much more ambitious and challenging, and therefore it feels like it's not rolling as much as it did previously. But we just have to do so much more hard work to get it going. At country level, just to bring us there, one of the roles that UNDP has is to, as I said, bring agencies together. And within the UN Development Group, which is a number of development-oriented ambitions amongst the UN agencies, there's been an agreement of something we call the MAPS. It's a mainstreaming and acceleration and policy support approach to how we work with member states in the implementation of the SDGs. And largely what we do is that we work with governments trying to go through their priorities, because it's owned by, and the custodians are, the governments of national countries, national states at national level, not the international community. But our obligation is to support them. So not only do we work in trying to translate the 16 goals plus the partnership elements that we come with to priorities, but also generating a very, very important discussion on the trade-offs. If you prioritize goals 6, 2, and 5, what effect and what knock-on effect might that have on 3, 8, and 2? Because, again, linking to resources, we might not be able to achieve all at once, even though we still want to have 2030 as the time when we do achieve these. Now, I know we're short on time, so I'm going to cut short a little bit of these, but I'm happy to put my notes to all of you to look at later on, because I wanted to mention also that, again, looking at what we do at country level, I was actually surprised, preparing for this event, to see the multitude of various events and activities going on amongst UN agencies and together with national and local partners. And I would say, with commenting on again, something that came up in the first panel, I'm glad that it inspired me and everybody else. I do think that the UN agencies, perhaps also with the UN Charter as we the peoples, as the basis for our activities, do focus a little bit more on the mass activities rather than the elite, even though there were very good explanations of how the elite is actually the top end of where we get the masses into sports. But I can mention a huge number of events taking place with various types of partnerships at country level. Just to say a few, the Global Goals World Cup, UNDP and the Air Foundation from Denmark in cooperation with the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It could have been the one that was referred to earlier, because it's a partnership also with the International Olympic Committee, Save the Children, the UN Global Compact, the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, which I'm sure also UNICEF is involved in. And this is at national level and has launched a global initiative which supports women's activist soccer tournaments designed to get girls and women engaged in the international development agenda, building on world community of activities for the Sustainable Development Goals, and more broadly expand advocacy for the SDGs. In this room, I know that after today, at least, the SDGs will be imprinted, and you all know what it is, but this is one of the main challenges with the implementation of the SDG agenda, that it's a fraction of the world's population that even know what SDG stands for. So it's really translating what it means, not necessarily the acronym, but what it entails for me as an individual, or for a little boy in Afghanistan or in Chile, wherever. That is really one of the big challenges that we face in country. But I can also mention a number of other partnerships with often Western donor groups providing the resources to make it possible for us to work with partners on the ground. There's Monaco's partnership where they put money into the coordination of SDG implementation amongst UN agencies, but specifically working on sports activities. There's the Tokyo Football League in Palestine, which has worked also on the kind of conflict prevention element amongst many of the youth in refugee camps. There is the Peace and Reconciliation Program in Papua New Guinea that also focuses on sports activities specifically. And I wanted to also mention one that I have been engaged in myself as a conflict prevention advisor, is the Youth Sports Against Gang Violence in Peru, where UNDP joined by UNODC, UNFPA, WHO, which is a very, very important partner in this collective effort around sports and SDGs, and the UN Regional Center for Peace and Disarmament jointly implement a youth sports program aiming to enhance community development and reduce not only physical harm through the violence that the gang violence generates, but also bring down the crime rates associated with gang violence amongst teenagers in Peru. We have a similar program in Jamaica that does the same.
Yeah. Panel 5 will also focus on some of the implementation. Thank you very much. We can see that the efforts go right through international UN agencies, international organizations, sports federations. What will be really interesting is, you all mentioned it, and panel 1 mentioned it, is the reception at the grassroots level. But I'm also thinking, since today we're talking about the implication of sports in this effort, what would be interesting to know at one point, and that will bring us to the last subject of this panel, is how did the sporting community, I'm talking about the athletes, both the amateur athletes and the competitors, receive the message, and how are they implementing it? And this brings me, as I said, to the last subject, which is a subject that Philippe likes very much, is measuring the impact and checking what's going on and how can we carry on. Since Valerio had relatively little time, I would ask him to speak first, because I might have to cut down the time on the others to finish in time.
Well, thanks, Professor. Yeah, no, absolutely. I think we at UNICEF, we always ask the same question that Philippe mentioned at the beginning. How can we really escalate the sport as a tool for development amongst the various strategies that the organization may have to achieve results for children, to build the evidence base, which is a fundamental prerequisite to obtain more resources, more senior buy-in from the chief of our agency, from the political debate. In this sort of result-oriented environment, everybody will take accountable the SDG implementer to actually provide evidence and really, really measure the achievements and the milestone towards all the targets that each and every one of the SDGs has. I think this is a bit of a debate that the whole sport for development industry, if I can define it like that, has grappled with for at least the last 10 years, if not more. It's a bit of a circular conversation. I think what we have, because you always ask yourself, well, what is the peculiar and specific impact that sport intervention has had on one end beneficiary? But you cannot really dissect or detect that if you do not consider the overall environment and the holistic approach that any intervention should have. So at UNICEF, we had decided to promote a strategy which fosters what we call an holistic child development model. We actually aims at not only never having like sport interventions at the grassroots level as a standalone project level one-off sort of NGO-like, if I can use that expression, activity, but to embed sport implementation and physical education, for example, in school curricula, so that it's made sustainable and throughout all the education cycle. And every sport intervention has to be sort of grounded into a much wider monitoring and evaluation framework that the whole operation of the organization at country level has, so that it can be sort of reinforced and strengthened by other sorts of monitoring that will happen, and that will still identify and will still bring about anecdotal evidence about the importance of sport as a tool, but is not so much concerned with, you know, singling that out, but just understanding that that is a fundamental component to achieve that outcome. Equally, though, we are developing more and more a sort of more scientific, if you like, mapping and action research. We have colleagues in the room here that comes from our Office of Research in Florence. We have a specific UNICEF think tank, if you like, dedicated just to produce action research of a number of topics. And we have chosen sport for development as an emerging area in which we would like to strengthen perhaps the academic solidity of whatever we say. So we are investigating with the support of our partners and many stakeholders how we can better bring about those case studies from a mapping point of view, but also going beyond from a sort of evidence-based point of view. But then, and also we believe, I have to say, because the power of our brand and a bit the marketing machine that is behind some of the activities that UNICEF does to promote children's rights, that the impact of sport is also soft impact based on outreach and sort of, you know, how you really touch the life of people through communication campaigns. You know, let's imagine the power of football or many other big sports in reaching out to a plurality of your audience that you would have not normally reached out to as a UN agency if it were not for the immense convening and vehicle power that sport has. So for us, impact is also impact on the perception, the awareness, and the sort of soft education that people develop by entering in touch with sport and through sport by accessing our organization and our mandate.
Thank you. Is that the same at the UNESCO?
Well, there are two different questions. One is on impact measurement. Yeah. And yes, impact measurement is indispensable if we want to convince investors and decision makers of the return on investment in sport as a development option that is competing with a number of others. But it is not sufficient. We know for health we have all the data, and yet physical activity doesn't appear anywhere in the SDGs, not even in the targets, which is tremendous disaster, I think, in terms of promoting the issue of sport and physical activity. How come? We have all the data. We know billions of dollars in national budgets, health budgets are wasted and lost because of physical inactivity. More people die from obesity than from hunger, and yet the SDGs haven't even mentioned the term physical activity. So yes, impact measurement is indispensable, and we have to work on it. We have to move away from aspirational talking and saying sport is fantastic and good, which we like doing amongst ourselves, towards something more evidence-based, get out of the box, because where the power is not necessarily where people are aware and convinced of that return on investment. So we need data very clearly to convince, and not just aspirational talk. Also, we are all believers and enthusiasts. Second, just I want to have a chance as well to inform you that we're not just moving on this international policy level. We do implement things at the country level also. We have by no means the country presence UNDP or UNICEF have. Quality education launched in 5 pilot countries together. A policy package developed with UNDP, with UNICEF, with WHO, around the table, developing standards for quality physical education, launched in South Africa, Zambia, Tunisia, Fiji, and Mexico right now. We are developing a number of initiatives in Asia again, fighting youth violence and discrimination. They use the Kazan Action Plan for a forthcoming fun shop amongst youth in the Philippines. So there are a number of initiatives. Just to give you another flavor of UNESCO, it's not just policy talking. We also, wherever we have the capacity, work with our partners from the UN system on the ground. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Wendy.
So impact is simply what matters the most by the end of the day is what you do at the local level.
That's it.
And that is also the message of the 2030 agenda is how do we localize it? How do we domesticate this issue? Having said that, one example I can give, the Beijing Olympics is in the context of air pollution. We did a lot of assessment work as UN Environment to showcase what does it mean having clean air in the city. What does that mean? And that assessment has clearly shown that if there are a few steps a country needs to take, if they do that, they could actually significantly reduce death from air pollution, which, by the way, is the biggest killer today, is air pollution. We have 600,000 people dying in Europe alone in Europe, 600,000 people from air pollution-related diseases. So the message is, show it. If you show it, that becomes an example for other cities to follow. And that is, again, what I said about cities. If these are our cities with the 70-plus problems we have from waste emission, pollution, and if we could build capacities in the cities, by the end of the day, your impact has to be measured by, do we have a clean planet? Is it populated by healthy people? If you have the answers yes to those two, I think we are doing okay.
Okay, great. So maybe Sarah, 30 seconds. Ladies last.
Linking to the measurement, I think that it might actually be good that it's not part of the formal measurement work and coming up with the indicators, with collaborating with the statistical commissions. And perhaps that methodology will finally be finalized 2030 to measure whether we succeeded with the 2030 agenda. But what we can do is, and I think that the Kazakh Action Plan actually gives us a great opportunity there, to work more coherently together to develop informal measurements in which the partnership with many of you can be emphasized in terms of how we collectively can measure the impact of our work.
Okay, thank you very much. I think it's time for questions and answers, hopefully answers as well, but anyways, let's start with a question. The Morrison.
Getting over there. I should have said this earlier, but the questions and answers are also being live streamed, so you know. So all this is being live streamed as well. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Patrick Asser, Head of Football and Social Responsibility from UEFA. I've heard now this sort of number games between 1 and 17. And I wonder why number 13, climate change and environment, and perhaps Alan will agree with me, doesn't play more of an important role here. And the focus, because I firmly believe that all other goals will very much depend on what's ahead of us. And I'm saying that not just before the Swiss mountains have started to collapse, that the hurricane season has been more devastating than ever, that the sea levels rise, etc. And I could go on. And then finally, I'm perhaps not going to be very popular here, but in terms of coordination of the UN bodies, I take note of the fact that the OGI Lemke office has been closed, and I think that's certainly not been a good decision for the future. Thank you very much.
Okay, I don't think there was a question, so maybe we go to the next. Why there was only 11, but I think we answered that in panel 1, that 11 are the focus is on those 11 now, but all the 17 are, of course, being implemented. This is what I understood. If you would like to complete.
I didn't want to quote all the 8 SDGs that are retained in the Kazakh Action Plan, but climate change and sustainability is one of them, as is employment and economic development. I forgot these two, I think, in the list.
Okay. Quick.
If I may add again, what is fundamentally important is how do we encourage responsible choices and responsible youth? And then we will not be talking about those disturbing disasters that we see today. It is about us. It's our own lifestyles. How do we change that?
John Morrison, Chief Executive of the Institute for Human Rights and Business, representing the platform on human rights and mega sporting events. I'm speaking after lunch. But my question, some of your agencies have protection or integrity mandates. And it's what I haven't heard enough about this morning, although we began together with the first panel, is the risk-opportunity nexus. Sport can never be risk-free from a development perspective or a human rights perspective. Mega sporting events certainly can't be risk-free. So where are you in terms of due diligence and protection and respect? What's the balance? How much risk are you willing to take in partnerships around sport if you think that the development legacy will outweigh the risk? So it's something about that due diligence balance with opportunity. Yeah.
Who would you think could?
the two, I mean, UNESCO and UNICEF, I mean, UNICEF has a protection mandate, UNESCO talked about integrity, so those two particularly, I'd like to know a little more about how you balance those two imperatives.
Okay, the entire Kazan action plan is focusing on grassroots sports. Major sport events with respect to the previous Minutes conference have almost disappeared from the agenda. They are addressed by the SDGs: economic development, employment opportunities, sustainability. And the question you raise is placed very clearly on top of the list under sport integrity, protecting the integrity of sports, is human rights, not just of participants, but of workers and all stakeholders concerned. So in terms of our methodology, we talk about benefits under the SDG contribution, and in terms of risks under the integrity part.
Valérie?
Yeah, thanks. That's a very good but also difficult question, so I'll try to respond to the best of my abilities. I think at UNICEF we trying to pride ourselves to be not risk adverse, but obviously risk aware at least. So we're not completely, you know, putting our head under the sand and thinking that it's a whole fantastic environment for human rights and we all happily, you know, partner with the world of sport. But at the same time, we want to do, as I said before, we want to do that with them and not like against or in sort of with different advocacy voices. We believe that multi-stakeholder platform and joint advocacy is perhaps more powerful than single agency-specific advocacy. So specifically on the human rights aspect, I think one strategy we chose is to run what we call impact assessments together with the stakeholders we partner with. For example, with the Commonwealth Games Federation, thanks to the partnership that we had in 2014 for the first time with the Games, which was fantastic in many respects. But we also used that entry point to sort of convince the stakeholder to say, why don't we together go and assess what impact this event is making, which is beyond, you know, all the fantastic results that we as an organization egoistically we had in terms of fundraising, brand exposure, positioning sport as a tool for development, but what impact really are you having on communities? And we do those assessments together. And then the other strategy is to do, you know, the buzzword of the UN system, but I've seen not only of the UN system, which is capacity building, you know, like you kind of try to enforce a child rights respecting culture within the industry. So we do not just speak authoritatively to preaching to the converter that we already know, like the international development field already is aware of the importance of children's rights, but we want to embed those within the sport. And if we do that in partnership with the industry, we believe we can get better results.
UNEP has an opinion on that?
Part of fundamental human right is actually the right to a clean, safe environment, which is well articulated in Article 24 of the Convention on the Right of the Child. So what do we do in terms of that to ensure this is guaranteed? Is how do we work with organizing committees? When we're talking about the games, we're talking about very fragile, pristine ecosystems. So working with them to ensure that sustainability is integrated into the work of the committee, but also delivering the games.
I myself understood the scope of today's discussions a bit wider than that. We are talking also about sports being practiced every day by millions of children in not necessarily an environmentally unfriendly way. They don't all practice their sports in a bird's nest. This is maybe nevertheless also the aspect you were talking about of the health aspect that all of you were talking about, that sports is healthy. There are risks, of course, and big events will have a big risk of a heavy impact, but that's not all there is in sports. I think maybe it's because one is more aware of that when you've had children, but sports is something that should be open to everybody. Okay, not talking about accident risk. We've all been to the emergency with our kids, but it is important. And it's true too that WHO, all the health issues have to be integrated in that risk evaluation.
Just I think one point also we should make in connection with this risk-benefit equation is that sport can harm, and not only because it discriminates or it exploits or it harasses, but also if it is not delivered in a quality manner. We can discourage children from practicing physical activity if they don't get quality physical education in their first age. So the quality issue is a central issue across different subjects. It's not just a question of human rights. Of course, it is a question of human rights, but also a question of quality delivery. Yeah. Just wanted to mention that.
Yeah.
Okay.
I completely agree with that.
Any other questions? Have we still got time for a question or two? Okay. Is it ladies or no? There's no ladies. Okay, please.
Excuse me.
Okay.
Okay.
No, go ahead.
Can I? Okay. Hello, my name is Nenad. I'm from ENGSO Youth. And first of all, thank you very much for all your information and action plans and concrete steps how to implement sport through sustainable development goals. As I'm here on behalf of ENGSO Youth, I was wondering, actually I would like to refer also to the first panel because there were 3 pillars and among one of them were also youth. So I was wondering how to actually implement or represent youth within all these action plans. And also how many youth organizations are here represented, because I think we have key stakeholders here and policymakers. And we would like to give youth, voice to youth in order to be heard and to give our inputs about how to implement sustainable development goals through sport. And the question goes to whoever would like, whoever feel like to answer. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll try to take that first, and then my peers can. Thanks so much for the question. Of course, I think at UNICEF we definitely have a mandate also for young people, and then you can debate around who are young people, until what age those go, and the usual sort of very brainy intellectual debate that we get entangled with. At UNICEF we say a child is a child until 18 years of age. So obviously all what we call the adolescent, the second decade of a child life, it's absolutely part and crucial part of our mandate. And obviously given country context and specificities of every single domain in the developing world, that can also go beyond. So absolutely in the over 50 country sort of case studies that you may find on our website, you will find that many relate to youth empowerment and to helping young people have a stronger voice as an actor of change of their own life within their communities is a crucial strand of work that UNICEF supports through the power of sport. So if you're more interested, please have a look or feel free to contact us separately. And definitely we partner with youth-centered NGOs in the field and grassroots organization, because also we want to tackle all the world that does all the things that a young person experience outside of formal environments, so outside of schools, outside of like classical spaces, and a lot of these are young people that may not be in schools, or they go to youth centers, or they just get involved with leadership and vocational skills training. But how can we use sport as an entry point to reach out to them, and also to give them a voice? I think your point about giving them a voice is fundamental. And we have a lot of volunteerism activities that actually put young people forward as the convener of messages and advocacy asks. So yeah, we are absolutely in agreement with you.
So maybe Sarah could add 1 or 2 words in
Thank you.
the name of the others.
I'll just add on to what you're saying. And for example, under Goal 16 on peaceful, just and inclusive societies, UNDP runs a global youth program, a platform that connects the network of national youth platforms to work more, engage more in the parliamentary agendas. That actually sets the priorities for SDG implementation. So we try to facilitate as much as possible and do both capacity building and training, bring many of these questions to the national level, hold workshops and to inform and raise the awareness around the whole SDG agenda with these youth platforms. And we also connect the various platforms with each other to make it a global movement. So there's lots of emphasis, and this is also done in partnership with many of the UN agencies on the ground in country, to actually, how would you say, mobilize the youth to engage more in this very important agenda of their future.
Okay, thank you. Wasn't there a lady who wanted a word? No? Yes, please. Please. Please.
That's very kind. Thank you very much. That's very kind. My name is Dr. Fiona Bull from the World Health Organization, so I'm delighted to have had mention of the SDG 3 and health, and thank you, Philippe, for your comments. And I'd like to bring the conversation back to the very basic and seemingly obvious. Sport is about participation. And so whilst I recognise and applaud the work about sport's role across all of the others, I'm going to indulge for a few moments on SDG 3. The participation rates currently are 1 in 4 adults do not participate in the modest 30 minutes a day, and 80% of adolescents don't participate. So my challenge to you all is, how are you increasing participation? The discussion about mega events is all well and good, but daily, your comment, Chairperson, children do not have the opportunities for good experiences, and the numbers bear it out. So I'd like to focus my comment on your introduction about numbers, because what gets measured gets done and gets funded. And the absence of action on physical activity at WHO and worldwide is because it doesn't get enough recognition, because we're not measuring it. So I've asked a colleague in hockey, how many participants have they got worldwide? And I'll ask all of you, how many participants have we got? Are you monitoring and tracking with a reliable data that can contribute to our quantification of impact of the role of physical activity, physical sport, and physical education? We have a major challenge, and that's why I'd argue we're being ignored. I'd got an invitation along with my challenge, and that is that the member states invited WHO to develop a new global action plan on physical activity. This work is underway, and I know some in this room, some of the UN agencies and some sports have contributed. It's underway. Consultation closed last Friday. I am the lead person and invite you to reach out to me. I offer your engagement, your involvement in making this World Health Organization Global Action Plan on physical activity meaningful and complementary to Kazan, and they very much are. But how do we implement these? So I'm positioning, I have, with your help, positioned sport as central to promoting physical activity. We have to deliver it, and we have to measure it. So I invite one question, Philippe. How are we going to proceed to collectively, in partnership, measure sports participation and therefore measure its contribution to SDG 3? Thank you.
Very obviously, yes. Please.
May I? I'm Claude Marshall with the UNHCR, UN Refugee Agency. I'm the Refugee Sport Coordinator. One of the things that I could add to that is that, unbelievably, we do not have an empirical measurement of what sport does for children under crises. We all have an instinctive idea of what it does, without a doubt. But if I went to a donor and I said, give us $200,000 for something that has to do with children who have run for their lives, lost their parents, lost their siblings, and escaped to safety of a refugee camp, as miserable as they are, prove to me that sports has done something positive for them, other than alleviate boredom. And I don't have it. The last piece I ever saw on this, and maybe you can correct me, is the, if I have the name correct, Beslam, the Ingushetia, maybe somebody has a better memory of it. Remember the crises in Beslan, right. There was a crisis of a couple of hundred children were murdered in the school. Yeah. And various sport organizations brought in the therapy of sport, and it was measured by an academic who was at the University of Zurich. And that's the last I've ever seen of anything like that. Maybe I've missed something. Yeah. So the challenge would be, add to what you are doing. We can give you a lot of places where we have children who have run from crises.
Yes, thank you very much. It's just perfect that you would mention that, because it allows me to close this panel, but to tell you that on panel 5, you will see one of the actions in place right now in refugee camps. It's a project called InZone, and I'm sure you'll be pleased to see what's happening there. Thank you very much. Thank you, members of the panel. So nice of you to be here, or for being here. Thank you.
And Margrethe, thank you too for marshalling that panel so expertly. We will resume at 2 o'clock as we start to hear from, in fact, some of you who've been putting questions out and can come and talk to us from an institutional point of view. And those challenging questions and being unpopular, that's a good thing, for the moment at least. So thank you very much indeed for that. So bear with me a second.
Coffee will be served downstairs, so it's lunch break and
right, you need to hear this. Lunch here and then coffee will be served down